Clara Hensley never liked silence. It felt like a void waiting to be filled, a space where things could creep in unnoticed. That's why she kept her days noisy. Podcasts blaring through her earbuds, the TV chattering in her tiny farmhouse kitchen, the hum of a fan even in the dead of winter. It was January 2025. The fields beyond her windows buried under snow, the nearest neighbor a mile off down a frozen dirt road. Clara was 29, a freelance illustrator who'd traded city noise for rural quiet 2 years back, thinking she'd find peace. Instead, she found a house that seemed to listen too closely, the creak of its beams too deliberate, the wind through its eaves too much like a sigh. She'd inherited an old ham radio from her uncle, a tinkerer who'd died the previous spring. It arrived in a cardboard box, taped shut with a note in his shaky scrawl. "For Clara, tune it careful." She'd laughed at that, picturing him hunched over the thing in his cluttered garage, chasing signals from nowhere. The radio was a relic, black metal casing dented, knobs gritty with age, a coiled antenna that wobbled when she touched it. She set it up in her attic studio, a slanted room with a single round window fogged by ice, figuring it'd be a quirky prop for her desk. That first night, she plugged it in just to see if it worked. The power surged as the cord met the outlet, a faint pop echoing through the attic. The radio hummed to life, its dial glowing amber, static pouring from the speaker, like sand through a sieve. Clara twisted the knob, half expecting nothing but noise. She got voices instead, faint, fragmented, overlapping like a crowd heard through a wall. A man muttering numbers, a woman singing off-key, a child's giggle cut short. She smiled, charmed by the randomness, and left it on low as she sketched, the chatter blending into her usual soundscape. But when she went to bed, the voices followed her downstairs, not from the radio, which she'd turned off, but from the walls, the floor, the air itself. A whisper, soft and wet. "Clara." She chalked it up to exhaustion, a trick of her tired mind. The next morning, the radio was silent when she flipped it on. Just static, no voices. She shrugged and got to work, but the attic felt different. Colder, the light dimmer, the windows frost thicker, curling into patterns that looked like eyes. That night she tuned it again, chasing that odd frequency she'd found before. 43.9. Peace, a spot her uncle's notes marked with a shaky star. The static cleared and the voices returned, sharper now. "Clara, here. Clara, stay." She froze, her pencil slipping from her hand. The chorus wasn't random. It knew her, called her, its tone shifting from curious to pleading as she sat there, breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. She unplugged it, dragged it to the basement, and locked the door behind her. But the house wouldn't let it go. Her TV flickered on at 3:17 a.m., the screen a blizzard of gray, the speakers hissing with whispers. "Clara, down. Clara, come." She yanked the plug, but the screen stayed lit, the voices seeping out. Her phone buzzed with static-filled voicemails, no caller ID, just her name over and over in tones that stretched and warped, some deep and gurgling, others high and keening. She deleted them, but they reappeared, timestamps shifting, some dated days ahead. The farmhouse groaned around her, beams creaking in rhythm with the whispers, as if the wood itself had joined the choir. By the fourth day, Clara stopped sleeping. She sat in the kitchen, lights blazing, a kettle screaming on the stove to drown out the noise. But the voices found her anyway, through the kettle's whistle, the hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock. They named her fears. Clara, alone. Clara, lost. They named her past. Clara, the crash. Clara, you ran. She'd survived a car accident at 19, a guilt she'd buried. Her friend hadn't made it, and she'd fled. The scene, never telling a soul. Now the radio knew, or whatever spoke through it did, and it sang her shame back to her in 1,000 dripping voices. She tried to leave, packed a bag, grabbed her keys, but the car wouldn't start, its engine, coughing static instead of turning over. The snow outside thickened, piling against the doors, the windows, sealing her in. Her phone's screen cracked on its own, spiderwebbing as it played a video she hadn't recorded. Her sleeping in bed, filmed from above, her chest rising and falling, her eyes twitching under lids. The whispers narrated, Clara, dreams. Clara, hours. She smashed it with a hammer, but the shards glowed, the audio looping from the broken speaker. The basement door unlocked itself that night. She heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, then footsteps climbing, heavy and uneven, like something dragging itself up. She barricaded the kitchen door with a chair, clutching a knife, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the house, thudding against the outer walls, scraping the windows with nails or claws or something worse. The radio was back in the attic when she checked, its cord plugged in, its dial spinning wildly. She smashed it again, glass and metal flying, but the pieces reassembled before her eyes, slowly, deliberately, the voices laughing. Clara. No. Clara. Stay. Her mirrors turned next. She caught her reflection in the bathroom, but it wasn't her. Her face was there. Yes, but behind it shadows loomed, tall and bent, their heads cocked at impossible angles, mouths moving with the whispers. She screamed, shattering the glass, but the shards reflected the same. Hundreds of tiny eyes, tiny mouths, all chanting her name. The lights flickered, bulbs popping one by one, plunging the house into a green-tinged gloom that pulsed from nowhere. Her skin itched. She found marks, thin red lines like static burns tracing her veins, glowing faintly when the lights went out. Desperate, she tried to burn the radio in the fireplace. The flames roared, black smoke coiling up the chimney, but the voices sang through the crackle. Clara. Fire. Clara. Join. The smoke didn't dissipate. It hung thick and oily, forming shapes in the air. Hands, faces, things with too many eyes. She doused it with water, but the ashes smoldered, whispering still, the room growing colder, the walls sweating frost that spelled her name in jagged loops. She ran upstairs, locked herself in the attic, but the window shattered. Word snow swirling with a sound like laughter, the chorus swelling. Clara. Here? Clara? Home? The voices grew physical then. She felt them. Cold, wet fingers brushing her neck, her arms, her face, pressing into her skin like damp clay. Her breath fogged, but it wasn't hers. It moved against her will, exhaling. Whispers that weren't her voice. Clara. Yes. Clara, us. She clawed at her throat, gasping, but the air thickened, filling her lungs with static, her vision blurring with green light. The attic floor creaked under unseen weight, shadows pooling in the corners, stretching toward her, their forms flickering. Human once, maybe, now twisted, mouths gaping, eyes hollow yet watching. She wrote a note that night, scrawled on sketch paper, with a trembling hand. They're in the house, they're in me. Don't tune to 43.9. She taped it to the attic door, hoping someone would find it. But the paper curled and blackened as she watched. the ink melting into whispers that stained the wood. The radio hummed louder, its dial still, its speaker, a void that sucked in light. She sat before it, staring into the grill, and felt the chorus pull, her thoughts slowing, her memories fraying, her name unraveling into theirs. The last thing she saw was her reflection in the window. Not her face, but theirs, 1,000 shadows smiling back. Days passed, then weeks. The snow melted, and a delivery driver found the farmhouse silent, the doors unlocked, Clara gone. Her car sat untouched, her phone a cracked husk on the kitchen floor. Its last recording 29 minutes long, static, then whispers, "Clara, gone. You, here." The attic was empty, the radio missing, but the walls bore scratches, names, hundreds of them, etched in frost-burned lines. Mark, Sarah, Tom, and more spiraling outward. The driver left, uneasy, and didn't hear the hum that followed him home. The farmhouse sits abandoned now, its windows dark, its fields overgrown, but locals say the air buzzes there, a static you feel in your bones. Radios glitch nearby, tuning to 43.9 on their own, and if you listen long enough you'll hear it. A choir, soft and wet, calling your name, waiting for you to answer. Evan Teller had always hated noise. The city had worn him down, car horns blaring through his apartment walls, neighbors shouting at 3 a.m., the relentless buzz of his cubicle's fluorescent lights. At 34, he was a husk, eyes sunken, hands jittery from too much coffee, a software debugger who'd stopped dreaming. Marrow's End promised escape. A friend had sent him the listing. Cabin, cheap, middle of nowhere, quiet as the grave. Evan didn't hesitate. He sold his car, packed 3 boxes, and took a bus 300 miles north, where the pines swallowed the horizon and the world fell silent. The cabin crouched at the edge of town, a mile from the nearest house, gray clapboard peeling like old skin, single story with a sagging porch, a brick chimney, and windows that stared blankly into the forest. Inside it smelled of damp wood and dust, bare walls, a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a chipped sink, and a bedroom just big enough for a mattress. The realtor, a wiry woman named Doreen with a smile too tight, handed him the keys on November, sire. "In peace like you've never felt," she said, her voice sharp, eyes flicking to the trees. "No neighbors to bother you. No nothing." Evan nodded, already imagining the stillness. He didn't notice her linger on the porch, watching him unpack, before she drove off too fast down the gravel road. That first night, the quiet hit him, like a wall. He'd expected calm, crickets maybe, or wind rustling the pines, but there was nothing. No hum of traffic, no distant dog barks, just a dense, suffocating silence that pressed against his eardrums. He stood on the porch, breath fogging in the crisp air, and listened. The forest loomed, a black mass of needles and trunks, the moon casting shadows that didn't shift. He clapped his hands, testing the space. The sound died, a flat thwack, no echo, swallowed by the stillness. Inside, he turned on his phone, played a coding podcast, but the voices sounded thin, flattened by the cabin's walls. He left it running as he slept, a tether to the world he'd left. By morning, the silence had settled deeper. He brewed coffee, the drip of the machine unnaturally loud, each splash a gunshot in the void. Outside, the pines stood rigid, no breeze, stirring their branches, their tips glinting silver under a pale sun. He walked the property, 50 yards of dead grass to the forest's edge, and found no birds, no squirrels, just stillness that clung like damp air. Back inside, he noticed the clock. It sat on the mantel, brass and tarnished, hands frozen at 11:47. He wound it, the key grinding in its slot, gears clicking faintly. The ticking didn't start. He tapped it, shook it, wound it again. Nothing. The silence thickened. A weight. The room, and he left it alone. Day 2, he tried to work. He'd brought his laptop, planning freelance gigs to pay the bills, but the screen's glow felt dim. The key's clacks muted. He opened a window. Still no wind, just cold air pooling in. The forest watched, its shadows long and still even. At midday, he closed the window, turned on music. Lo-fi beats, a playlist he'd loved in the city. The bass didn't thump, the notes fell flat, absorbed by the cabin's bones. He cranked the volume, but the sound barely reached the walls. Frustrated, he stepped outside, shouted, "Hello," into the trees. His voice vanished, a dead-end yelp, and the silence rolled back heavier, as if offended. That night, he woke. To his breath, sharp, uneven, the only sound in the dark. The podcast had stopped, his phone dead despite a full charge. He fumbled for the lamp, its click loud but the light weak, casting a yellow pool that didn't touch the corners. The room felt off, darker, the air rippling like heat over asphalt. He lay back, heart thudding, and told himself it was exhaustion. The city withdrawal. He'd adjust. Day 3, the footprints appeared. He found them at dawn, bleary-eyed, shuffling to the kitchen. Bare, shallow impressions in the bedroom carpet, small, child-sized, toes splayed, leading from his mattress to the front door. He froze, coffee mug trembling in his hand. He lived alone. No kids in Marrow's End, Doreen had said. He knelt, touched one. Soft, no dirt, just a dent in the fibers. Sleepwalking, he thought. Had to be. He vacuumed them away, the motor's whine piercing the quiet, and checked the locks. All secure. The day passed uneasily, coding errors piling. Up, the forest pressing closer through the windows, though he couldn't prove it moved. Night 4, the prints returned. Deeper, toes curled tight, as if gripping the floor. They stopped at the door again, a faint smear where they turned back. Evan's stomach twisted. He dragged the couch against the door, wedged a chair under the knob, and sat up with a kitchen knife, eyes stinging from lack of sleep. The silence grew physical, brushing his neck, pooling in his lungs. He heard nothing. No creaks, no steps, but felt watched, the air shifting when he blinked. Morning came, gray and still. The prints clustered at the chair, a tight knot, like something had stood there, patient and unmoving. He drove to town, a 10-minute haul down a road flanked by pines that leaned too close. Marrow's End was a blink. Gas station, diner, post, office, houses huddled tight. He stopped at the gas station, asked the clerk, a man with a patchy beard and twitchy hands, about the cabin. "Quiet's what we've got," the clerk muttered, bagging Evan's radio purchase. "Keeps to itself. If you let it." His eyes darted to the trees, then away. At the diner, a gray-haired woman stirred coffee that didn't ripple, her spoon silent in the cup. "Folks leave it be," she said when he pressed. "You should too." Her stare followed him out, unblinking. Back home, he plugged in the radio. Cheap plastic AM/FM with a wobbly antenna. Static hissed, a lifeline, and he tuned it to white noise, letting it hum through the cabin. For an hour it held, the crackle a comfort drowning the quiet. Then it cut out. A low drone replaced it, deep, resonant, like a tuning fork struck underwater. The windows rattled faintly, the clock's hands twitched to 11:48. Evan turned. It off, unplugged it, but the drone lingered, vibrating in his chest. He threw it in the closet, slammed the door. The silence returned, smug, heavier than before. Sleep stopped coming. He'd lie awake, breath loud in his skull, feeling the quiet shift, deliberate, alive, brushing his arms like damp cloth. The footprints grew. Longer, narrower, heels dug in, circling his bed, trailing to the windows, then the kitchen. He nailed the curtain shut, but the drone seeped through, louder in the dark, a pulse in his bones. Outside, the pines loomed. Closer. 10 yards from the porch now, though he'd swear it was 50 before. Their shadows bent wrong, curling toward the cabin even at noon, sharp and still under a sun that barely warmed. Day 7, he saw it. He'd stumbled to the kitchen for water, 3 a.m., the silence a weight on his shoulders. A silhouette stood by the sink, tall, thin, arms dangling past its knees, darker than the room's shadows. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just was, a hole in the light. The drone swelled, his teeth aching, the air so thick he gagged. He blinked, and it was gone. The footprints were wet now, black, sticky, pooling in the carpet, smelling of rust and salt. He scrubbed them with bleach, hands shaking, and found the note, yellowed paper under the rug, inked in shaky cursive. Don't fight the quiet. It takes what it wants. He burned it in the sink, the flame silent, smoke curling without scent. The power died on day 9. No flicker, no storm, just darkness. The cabin plunging into a gloom that pulsed with the drone. He lit candles. Their flames freezing mid-dance, wax pooling but not dripping. The silhouette returned, closer. By the couch, head tilted, listening. Evan shouted, his voice cracking mid-word, swallowed by the quiet. The figure stepped forward, leaving steaming prints, and he ran. The door wouldn't budge, the knob cold and slick. The windows fogged with breath not his own, smearing into shapes. Eyes, mouths watching. The drone hammered his skull, a rhythm he couldn't shake. He hid in the attic, a cramped space under the eaves, accessed by a pull-down ladder. He clutched a flashlight, its beam dimming with each breath, and waited. The cabin groaned, slow, heavy steps climbing the stairs below. The ladder creaked, dust falling in silent plumes, and the silhouette filled the hatch. Its face was a blur of stillness, eyes like holes, mouth a slash of black, its limbs bending wrong as it rose. The drone peaked, a soundless scream, and Evan's heartbeat slowed, sinking to the pulse. His flashlight died. His hands went numb, fingers slipping from the knife. The quiet pressed in, filling his lungs, his eyes, his thoughts. He scratched a message into the floor with a nail, each letter a gasp. It's in the silence, don't come. The mail carrier found the cabin 3 weeks later, door ajar, pines pressed against the walls, their trunks flush with the porch. Inside, dust hung still, the air thick and unyielding. The clock sat at 11:49, ticking backward. Slow, deliberate, the only sound in a town that didn't hear it. Evan's laptop lay open, screen cracked, last file a string of gibberish. It waits, it waits, it waits. The attic hatch hung loose, the floor scratched with his warning, smeared with black prints that trailed to the edge and stopped. The carrier left, throat tight, and didn't mention the hum that followed her truck home. A low, patient drone, waiting for her to stop moving. Marrow's End stays quiet now. Locals don't talk about the cabin, won't meet your eyes if you ask. The pines grow thicker each year, swallowing the road, the town, the sound. At night, if you stand at the edge, the silence hums, soft, heavy, calling your name in a voice you can't hear but feel, deep in your bones, waiting for you to answer.